Okay, so starting directing, we've got initial ideas about the play, we've got initial ideas about our section in particular and the characters, what to use, and and I'm going to talk a bit about the carousel that we did when we looked at the different kids. And talk a little bit about our introduction to what we started analysing in DNA about casting ideas. I have done separate short videos about the characters and the hierarchy, and I think we sort of established who we were gonna cast, but then I also had the initial ideas and who we ended up getting. So this is like an overall vlog about like our initial ideas and then who we end up getting because of the real life scenarios. So here I have got some of our initial ideas. So first I'm going to talk about the carousel. So the carousel, Hannah wasn't there, so I did the carousel. And we also came in the second week to sort of evaluate the kids from a different perspective and look at other directing styles. This was quite beneficial because it meant that we could not only just look at how the kids interact to different like directing types and which one they preferred and which one they worked well with, but also about the different directing styles, what intrigued the kids, what worked best in terms of like the amount of talking. So some directors, talked more and the kids sort of tend to switch off, whereas when it was very interactive, when they were asking a lot of questions, the kids were more interactive, more into it, and I feel like this would be a better way to approach directing in terms of like trying to get them to engage, enjoy, and then they'll be more focused on learning their lines and you'll be able to achieve more out of them in terms of the way you want them to act. So when looking at the carousel, I did an exercise on status, so using card and a card game to create gestus and characterization, that each person would have a number and that would equate to their status. This meant that when they were walking around, they would behave and treat each other as if the status they saw. They would then devise a short scene to show off their status. And then this also allowed me to sort of talk to them a bit afterwards about what they thought about the exercise, what they thought it was trying to show, and also trying to explain a bit about like the script to them, the people who didn't know. So it was quite a lot to get through, but I think this exercise was good because it allowed them to have sort of more of an interactive approach in terms of like the main messages of DNA, especially for those who had studied it before. They'll have more of an insight, but it's not like I'm just getting them to read off a script. It allows them to sort of think more deeper about like their characterization. I think when we're actually running and rehearsing, it'll be more about the script. So if they have this foreground of like understanding the main messages of the play, then this allows them to like build up on their character, so they already know a lot about like the messages and the themes, so they can just focus on learning their lines and getting the characterization right. Also when in terms of building up a relationship with them, I want them to be able to talk to me about line difficulties, or even like in terms of characterization techniques, things like that I want them to achieve, and I want them to be able to have a good working relationship with me and Hannah, so that we can achieve the best in terms of what we want the play to show and how we want it to look, and also their own personal flair towards the acting, so we can have a good communication. Definitely as directors, I feel like me and Hannah are more communicators than dictators, so we want to focus on looking at how they feel the character should be, or how they think they should portray the character, and we'll talk to them about this, and then we'll meet at a midpoint. We'll also be directing them to how we want them to portray it, but if they feel like, oh well, I feel like the character might be like this, then there's sort of a discussion that could take place, and I think that will be really good and beneficial for them for their exam as well, but also for us in terms of directing, to have a clear understanding of like why the character would do a certain thing, and then that would lead into more of the acting later on. So initial ideas, I thought that a lot of the kids were really good in terms of showcasing skill, communication, in terms of providing ideas and working well together as well. A lot of them of different years were put together and they really worked well, even though they'd like never known each other and things like that, so it worked really well. And also they took advice and support really well when I came round, sort of asked them what they were doing or asked if they needed any help or gave them some ideas. They really took to it and they really took it really well. So we had some initial ideas. I talked about beforehand like how the characters are in terms of like their characteristics, but in terms of who we would cast in, especially in a professional environment, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the type of person that we would cast. So, first of all, Mark and Jan. Mark and Jan are almost like this comedy duo, the storytellers of what's going on. They often break the action throughout the whole play. In our section, I think we have them break it twice. And it's sort of like this bit of a narrative to explain to the audience what's going on, but in a sort of fun way. The play is quite serious and it's got this dark under message, but they're like fun and like there are some comedy aspects to it because it's like a group of teenagers and it wants to show that, and I feel like Mark and Jan are the characters that provide this. So we wanted actors with good chemistry, who are close friends in real life, who could play quite comedic characters, who showed a lot of enthusiasm, who felt like the lines themselves would work really well. It would be someone in terms of like height or the way they held themselves quite strongly. A lot of the times like mid-height probably, not too tall, not too small, but it was mainly about how they presented themselves. So someone who was fairly confident to play Mark and Jan. Also got a lot of short choppy lines, so that's where the chemistry comes in. They need to be able to talk to each other about their characters. They probably would be good for them to spend quite a lot of time together outside of rehearsal as well, so they can talk about it. And ideally, the whole like presence being there, this good facial expressions in the bigger group scenes, because they're not always talking, but they're often providing this like slight context to it all. Lou is a smaller character. She only has a couple of lines in our section because also we don't have Danny in our section, who is also a smaller character, and we don't have John, so I won't really talk much about them. In terms of like the hierarchies and things like that I spoke about before, obviously Danny would be down below and John had gone from the top to sort of at the bottom. So, but I'm not going to dwell on them because they're not really in it. So back to Lou. Lou is probably down at the bottom. Someone who is ideally would be smaller, someone who ideally would be more reserved, a bit quieter, even more shy would work. Someone who had a smaller presence on stage, so not necessarily like, doesn't have to be always quieter, but ideally someone who is small, doesn't take up a lot of space. To visually, you would sort of be drawn to her as a sensible, small, sort of like a quiet type, especially because she's being overshadowed by all these other characters in the mix. And because we have limited actors as well, I'll talk about this afterwards, about who we actually got cast. I'll probably do that in the next blog, because I'll talk more about like realistically and how we came over the problems that we faced. So next, we thought about Kathy. Kathy being someone who is strong, independent, things like that, but also who's a real attention seeker and a gossiper. So in terms of trying to cast someone for this, we thought definitely of a year 11, someone who has got a bigger stage presence, someone who could show a contrast, because Kathy at the beginning doesn't have a lot to say, she hasn't got a lot of stage time, and towards the end she's the one who actually kills Adam, and she's the one who's all for it, and she loves the attention of it all, and she's ruling the roost right at the end. So in terms of that, you want someone, an actor capable of showing that scope, that character, and that journey that character has made from one point to another, and being able to show that requires quite a lot of skill, requires quite a lot of communication, someone who is capable of exhibiting like the contrast, and also like this kind of malicious background I feel like Kathy has, especially because she doesn't really care about what happens to Adam. She just doesn't want to go to prison, she doesn't want to get punished for what the group has done, and so literally resorting to her actually killing him. not saying she necessarily like really loved it, but she seemed a lot more happy with it, and she seemed like she was okay doing it, and it's kind of disturbing to see how her character has changed throughout this whole process of this play. So we looked at someone who had a strong stage presence as well, someone who could hold their own, who was capable of showing that character arc, that character change. And it was really important mainly to show how they could have more dimensions to their character. I feel like Lou, it would be easier to play as a one-dimensional character, but Kathy has to have these underlying like senses of potential worry and stuff, but she pushes through it and she shows off this facade as like, I'm popular and that's more important to me. Then we've got Leah and Phil. Leah and Phil is really interesting. I've spoken a lot about him and I've spoken a lot about Leah too. In terms of casting, Leah and Phil are together a lot. The chemistry of them is not as strong as Jan and Mark because Phil's often ignoring Leah. But in terms of the actors, we want them to be able to feel comfortable playing next to each other, off each other sometimes, because even though Phil's not saying anything, he needs to be able to react to what Leah's saying in terms of facial expressions, or even like in terms of ignoring her. Leah was probably hard to cast. Phil was quite difficult because you want someone who can show good facial expressions, who doesn't necessarily need to learn a lot of lines, but who is quite strong, can hold the stage, and who everyone is slightly intimidated by. But Leah herself was hard to cast because it's someone who needs to talk a lot for a long amount of time, who needs to act off someone who's not really responding, needs to feel comfortable doing that with someone else who is playing Phil. And from personal experience of playing Leah, someone who needs to be able to keep the character alive with high energy, but at the same time keeping it real. So in terms of actually doing this, we'll probably break the sections apart of the long monologues so that we can figure out how to physically make it reasonable for the actors to do, for our cast to do, whoever plays Leah. So looking at someone who seems like a popular type girl, who seems confident, who is like good at learning lines. In terms of visuals, I would say like fairly long hair, if you were going to be stereotypical about it, and maybe a bit quirky, especially because she often is talking about some really random things. I know not in our section, but earlier on she talks about bonobos and stars and the meaning of the universe, and then she talks about Phil and his waffle. And in our section, it's about this. Throughout the whole play, she's struggling to get Phil's attention, but throughout this whole section, she actually ends up walking away from him, and it sort of crushes Phil more than he would have realised. So this sort of impact that she actually does have on Phil, and it's this whole complex relationship between the two of them that will be really hard, I think, for Leah to communicate, but we'll definitely have to work with whoever plays Leah in terms of that, and in terms of casting. Next we have Brian and Adam. Brian and Adam, very interesting, unique characters. Brian especially, because he's been taking medication, he's gone a bit crazy, and in terms of casting, when I looked around, the people that I thought could play him was a wide scope of people, and there wasn't really any particular characteristic that I thought. Potentially, I thought someone who could be potentially a bit more vulnerable, especially towards the beginning. He's the weepy one who's often taken advantage of. Towards the end, he's always really happy and kind of crazy, and it's because of this medication that he's taking that's induced this, because he has severe depression and things like that, and anxiety about the whole situation. So it's about him being able to have an actor who can facilitate that, the medication that's creating this characteristic, to a point where it's comedic, to a point where it's breaking the group and it shows the destruction that it's doing to a particular member, but not in a really unrealistic way. we need someone capable of having that physically, as I said, I wasn't really particularly looking for someone physically. It was more about their ability in terms of being funny, but not pushing it too far to the point where it's offensive and it doesn't have any serious undertones. We needed it to have this serious sort of message underneath it all, because there is a reason why he is behaving like that, and it's because he thinks they've killed his friend and that he is part of this and that he's not dealing with it well. So in terms of all that, this character, this actor needs to be able to facilitate all that, needs to be able to show that Brian is struggling, but that his facade is that he's just really crazy right now. Someone who would also strive off that, so enjoy playing Brian. We want someone to have the capability and actually like playing Brian, so I think that's really important. And then with Adam's someone who also needs to learn a lot of lines, someone who can have emotion, as Adam's doing a really long monologue where he's sort of gone a bit crazy, a bit nuts, but he's been living on his own and he thought he was dying and there was blood on his head, and all about the fact that he is an outsider, that he has been found, that he's been brought back, and he's an outsider. And that they don't know what to do with him, and he's sort of gone a bit crazy, and he's not as crazy as Brian, but he's has a really long emotional monologue, and either he says it in like a monotone way, or that the lines are written really staggered so it's broken apart. And I think that in terms of trying to cast this, we've envisioned someone who is smaller, someone who doesn't have as much in terms of like intimidation and stuff. They're probably right at the bottom of the hierarchy along with Brian, but mainly visually someone who is quite small but who can have the ability to show intense emotion when need be, shows that they are weaker and are still controlled by everyone, even when they've overcome the fact that Adam could have died, that the character could have died. And then finally we have got Richard. Richard is not really in the scene a lot. His presence is there, but then in the end he does a really big monologue which explains everything that's happened because of the incident to Phil up on a field. Richard is a complex character in our section because there's nothing that he says before he says his own monologue. So in terms of his presence, it's really odd, and we'll probably get the character who plays Richard to do physically more than the others because he doesn't have any lines to say. And that'll be something for the character to have to overcome. In terms of his character arc, I think, because I hadn't spoken about him before because we weren't sure whether we were going to get a Richard or not, his character arc is definitely one of the higher ones, one who always argues with John and Mark, and who always has an opposition, who always stands up, and in the end he's sort of towards the bottom or becomes less involved in the whole situation. So in terms of his character arc, he becomes less of a opposition, less of a confrontational character, and he sort of is asking Phil to come back at the end, and he's more of a caring, tentative character. And I think because we only have the section that shows he's more caring, we could still show a bit of a transformation to him being involved, or him potentially disagreeing with what's going on, or him not wanting to be there or to be involved in certain aspects of it, especially towards the end when they kill Adam. But then in the end he obviously knows everything that's gone on, and he's trying to get Phil to come back. He doesn't like Kathy being in charge. So in terms of an actor, I think if you were choosing to play Richard in the whole piece, the whole script, you would choose someone who is a bit bigger, who takes up more space, and who is larger and taller, because he initially seems more intimidating, but then towards the end he's actually shown that it's not what it seems to be. And I feel as long as it's a contrast with Phil, because Phil at the beginning seems like the opposite, they almost switch places in terms of being confrontational, being clever. They switch places, and it's towards the end, and Phil is the one who has sorted it all out, who has instigated the killing of Adam, and who's been quite malicious, and Richard towards the end is really like, doesn't really say much, doesn't get involved. All he wants is for things to go back to normal. And so there's this whole dynamic of that that's really important. So in terms of castings, that would be something we'd look out for, someone who is a bit bigger but who could play a more conserved character in our section. So yeah, that was what we did in terms of the carousel, and in terms of initial casting ideas. I talked more about like the messages of DNA and the hierarchy and themes, what we're trying to communicate. Next we'll talk about who we actually got cast, and what difficulties we faced in terms of that, and what other challenges when it comes to like doing our first directing, and things like that we've come across.